Welcome back to The Great Gatsby. Today we're going to look at Chapter 1. We're going to discuss a little bit about the summary, what's going on in the story. We'll have a little bit of discussion about the characters since we are in Chapter 1, and we're going to start introducing the themes. So when we get into characterization, I have a tendency to give some quotes so we can kind of get a feel more of the characters. And here we're going to start with Daisy Buchanan, who is the female lead in the story, and she's describing her daughter. And she says, "I'm glad it's a girl, and I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool." I don't quite think she's describing her daughter. She might more be describing herself, or at least what she thinks she's expected to be. So let's look a little bit at the summary. When we start Chapter 1, Nick has moved from the Midwest to work in New York City as a bond businessman. Now, his cousin Daisy lives close by with her husband Tom, and so he decides to go give them a visit. He hasn't seen them in a while. He meets Daisy's friend Jordan for the first time, and he's quite attracted to her. And in this meeting, he first hears about a man by the name of Jay Gatsby. Now, class is one of the most important themes in the novel. You're going to notice how that affects the relationships of the characters. We find out that Jordan does work for a living, but she's a professional golfer, and she's also played tennis in the past. She's from a middle to upper class society. Daisy and Tom come from upper class. They have inherited their money, and so when they live out in East Egg, they have the money, they have the inheritance, they come from old money. Whereas Nick is middle class, he's working as a bond businessman. They're going to not so much poke fun at him, but ask him about how the bond business is going. How is it like to work? Now, much of the way that people are treated can be linked to their class and social position in society, and so Nick feels a little bit awkward kind of hanging out with these guys. Now, he is non-judgmental, at least in this part of the story, but he's very much aware that these people can just laze around on any day and they can do whatever it is that they want, and he knows that sooner or later he has to leave the party because he has to go to work tomorrow. And again, I talked about our previous quote in Chapter 1. We have a quote from Daisy Buchanan, who, as she tells us that she has a daughter, she shares with Nick almost this cry for help, where she hopes that her daughter's a beautiful little fool, which makes Nick think he's talking more about herself, that she feels that she's kind of trapped in this very shallow kind of behavior that she needs to do. So the social position of women is definitely criticized here. Now, Daisy's actually a witty and a clever woman, far more so than her husband, who she calls a brute. But she's the one that's being treated as inferior because it's the 1920s and she's a woman. She's not allowed to be head of the household. She has to let Tom make the decisions. Now, at the end of the chapter, when Nick comes home, he's got to come home fairly early because he's got to go to work tomorrow. He sees Gatsby at the end of the chapter on the dock, and he's reaching out towards the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. We're unsure as to why he's doing this. As we're about to go and introduce ourselves, because we figured we heard his name before, and that's enough for an introduction, he has disappeared. So let's introduce you to the main character of Nick Carraway. Now, Nick often becomes a confidant for those with troubling secrets because he is our peripheral narrator. We want to know what people's conflicts and secrets are because Nick is going to tell us. Now, The Great Gatsby is told entirely through Nick's eyes. His thoughts and perceptions are going to shape and color the story. So he is a bit of a biased narrator. He is going to make us feel his interpretations of the characters. Now, Nick is the hardest character to understand in the book because he's the narrator. He's only going to give us an impression of himself that he would like to give. We don't hear from Daisy or Tom's or Jay's point of view what they think of Nick. Now, Nick tells the reader in Chapter 1 that I am one of the few honest people I've ever known. And yet, over the course of the book, you're going to see him lie on several occasions. So it's all but impossible just to get an accurate picture of Nick. By the end of the book, you're going to notice he is very jaded. He's very disillusioned. When he and Jordan break up, he says, "I'm 30. I'm 5 years too old to lie to myself and call it honor." So the experience that he's going to have with Gatsby throughout this book and the others is going to take its toll on him. You can kind of hear that a little bit in Chapter 1, but you're going to see more as we continue through the other chapters. Now, Nick is supposed to be the moral arbiter for us. Everything is seen through his conscience, so because we only have his character exhibiting morals and decency throughout the novel, he's supposed to be our quote-unquote good guy. He's the one who's supposed to represent our own values. And he tells us he has a backbone. He won't be rumored into an engagement in chapter 1. How dare he be put in a marriage? So when we take a look at some of the lines that Nick tells us, one of the first things that he tells us on page 1 is that his father gave him some advice. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you have had. Well, Nick shares this advice because he wants the reader to know he's not a man who jumps to conclusions. He wants to give people the benefit of the doubt. We need to establish Nick as a sympathetic character. We need him to be our credible narrator. He's not the main character, so we need him to be credible. Now, when he starts telling us that he came back from the East last autumn, he starts establishing the filter of time when he tells us that this is a flashback on page 2. And then he gives us a little bit more information about the prominence of his family. My family have been prominent, well-to-do people for 3 generations. So when his participation in socializing and money and privilege, it should be pretty believable. Even though Nick has to work for a living, he tells us he's from quite a prominent family. So when he gets into what he works on, he talks about the books of investments and securities stood like new money from the mint. He tells us then that maybe perhaps he's not that good at his job. He's got books in which he's supposed to educate himself on how to better work, but they're just sitting on the shelf. And it tells you as much of what happens in East Egg and West Egg. Basically, the books are about investments in securities. He's hoping to invest other people's money. He doesn't have his own money. Hopefully then he's going to earn his money legally and through hard work. And the author is now drawing a comparison here between the books and mint condition, because coming from the mint can signify new money. Gatsby's going to represent new money. West Egg, where both of these gentlemen are, represents new money. So we're going to see a social stratification here. When he talks in chapter 1 about Daisy and Tom, he calls them, even before we introduce them, 2 old friends whom I scarcely knew at all. That's an oxymoron. He called them old friends, which indicates you got a deep friendship with them, and yet he states he scarcely knows them. Perhaps this is going to foreshadow a fact that even though he thinks he knows them, he'll find out that he knows absolutely nothing about them. It also suggests the superficiality of the upper class. Daisy is a relative of Nick's. Tom is an old college friend. He should be close to these people. He's known them for a long time, and yet he does not know them well. Their relationships have always been just on the surface and superficial. Now, we have personification being used to make the Buchanan Palace seem alive. The lawn appears as a runner, and it starts at the beach, and it jumps over sundials, and it runs up the wall of the house, which draws the reader and Nick towards the house, giving the impression that things are alive. You want to be in this house. And Tom is immediately described with a negative tone. Now, we have him being bossy and a muscular man. He's in his 30s with arrogant eyes. The first time we really hear from Daisy as she discusses Tom, she talks about how he hurt her pinky and calls him a brute. You're going to be seeing a lot of negative connotations, such as arrogant and proud and hard and shifting and cruel in describing Tom. That's because Fitzgerald wants you to immediately dislike this man. Now, Fitzgerald creates a light and airy mood in the home by having the wind flowing through the room, even though it's quite warm. He wants to have this life continuing on into the house. It lifts the curtains, it ruffles the ladies' dresses. He even uses a simile comparing the couch to a balloon to add an airy and light feeling. And the girls talk about feeling paralyzed with happiness. It's a light place that you want to be. Now, the hyperbole, the whole town is desolate, when Nick describes how they've missed Daisy in Chicago. It's used to add humor and to emphasize the superficial boredom of the upper class, where she just decides, let's go tomorrow, let's go back to Chicago. Most people can't just up and leave and just go across the United States just on a whim. But Daisy and Tom could. So Nick is annoyed that Tom is quick to remark he's never heard of the bond company that Nick works for. It's Tom's way of diminishing Nick and keeping him in his place. I don't care where you work. I don't know who you work for. He doesn't need to care. He has all of his own money. So looking at some of the symbols, we start looking at East Egg and West Egg. Now, one of the more important themes in the novel is class and social understanding, and it's a barrier for almost every character. So the barrier that the water creates between East Egg and West Egg is almost symbolic of the barrier that keeps these people apart from one another. So when we see the green light shining from the old money of East Egg, it entices Gatsby towards what he always wanted. Gatsby wants to go over to East Egg. That's where old money and respectability is. That's where Daisy is. The green light. The green is the color of promise, the color of hope. It's this multifaceted piece of symbolism in the book. Its most obvious interpretation is the light is symbolic of Gatsby's longing for Daisy, that if he could, green light means go and get her. But that might be a little bit too simplistic. Now, Gatsby has spent his whole life longing for something better. Maybe green could be money and success and acceptance. So maybe the green light could just mean the idea of money. And no matter how much he never feels complete without this idea of money and success. Even when he has his large house full of interesting people and all of their attention, he still longs for Daisy. And then lastly, let's take a look at the themes that are being started up in Chapter 1, the effect of wealth. Wealth is depicted as selfish and shallow. When Nick starts talking about his business and his work, Tom could care less. When he describes Tom has actually shipped his polo ponies on an airplane in the 19-teens when airplanes are brand new. The effect of wealth is very evident in Chapter 1. The morals of people with great wealth seem to be less than desirable here, but the wealthy are more socially accepted than the lower classes, so even though they're not showing anything but a sense of shallowness and a lack of morals here, we're still accepting that as okay. Now, at the end of Chapter 1, when we see Gatsby reaching out towards the green light, his single goal in life to go and get Daisy, his hope, becomes quite natural. It's just the beginning. And then the sense of ignorance, where we talk about how Daisy's hoping her daughter can be a beautiful little fool someday. She's kind of describing herself. She's a very intelligent person, but she's not allowed to use any of it because as a woman, she's expected to follow the role and keep to her husband. So your characters have little self-knowledge and even less knowledge of each other. I mean, we even hear from Nick that he's got old friends in Tom and Daisy whom he scarcely knew at all. Thank you so much for stopping by for Chapter 1 of The Great Gatsby. We will continue on into the other chapters if you just stick around my channel. I also did an introduction for this, so if you check out my playlist, please go and learn some more about The Great Gatsby. And as always, I'd appreciate if you could subscribe to the channel.